In the summer of 1949, deep in the marshy labyrinth of the Atchafalaya Basin, whispers spread about a shack that seemed to sink into the mud as if it wished to disappear. The shack belonged to the Boudreau family, whose name had long been spoken with a mix of pity and unease. Inside, two brothers lived, Philip and George, known across the backwaters as the Crooked Brothers. Their faces bore the marks of heavy deformities, twisted bones, and sunken eyes that made them appear carved by something crueler than time. Their story began decades earlier when their mother, Marie, had locked herself away from the judgment of neighbors in the late 1920s. Once a lively young woman, she had withdrawn into silence after being publicly shamed by the community for the origins of her children. She built a life inside the cabin with boarded windows and a single creaking door, raising her sons in isolation. The bayou became their prison, and the mud trails their only roads. By the time the brothers were grown men, the outside world had nearly forgotten them. Hunters passing through the swamps would catch glimpses of their hunched forms along the waterline, dragging fishing nets or carrying bundles of wood. Few dared approach, for the family carried a reputation heavy with unease. Children in nearby villages were warned not to wander near the shack, told stories that their eyes might twist if they looked too long at the brothers, but silence does not remain unbroken forever. In 1949, a rumor began to surface. Low, quiet, carried in the drawl of bayou neighbors. Some claimed to have heard the faint cry of a child from within the shack. Others said they saw shadows at night, smaller than the brothers, moving behind the cracks of the boarded windows. The whispers spread like water through reeds, impossible to stop, growing darker with each retelling. The idea that the Crooked Brothers might not be alone in their isolation struck fear and fascination into the community. In a land where gossip often meant survival, the bayou people began to weave their own explanations. They recalled Marie's refusal to leave the cabin, her defiant silence when questioned, her sharp eyes that followed any who dared come near. And they remembered how, even after her death, the brothers refused to bury her body in the churchyard, instead lowering her into the wet soil behind the shack, marking the grave with nothing but a crooked wooden cross. Now, with whispers of a hidden child, suspicion sharpened. What secret could two deformed brothers living in the ruins of their mother's shame be hiding behind rotting wood and swamp mist? It was not only curiosity that pulled the neighbors closer, but a kind of fear, a belief that something unnatural had taken root in the shack and that the bayou itself was sheltering it. The story of the Crooked Brothers was no longer about deformity or shame. It had become a story of inheritance, secrecy, and the possibility of a hidden bloodline growing in the dark. The year was 1950, when the first neighbor claimed to hear the unmistakable wail of a child drifting from the shack. It was a humid night, the kind when even the air seemed to sweat, and the sound carried across the cypress swamps like a thread pulled taut. The neighbor swore he saw a small hand clutching the edge of a broken shutter before it was yanked back into the shadows. Soon others added their voices, each insisting they too had seen or heard something that could not be explained. The brothers themselves rarely spoke to outsiders, and when they did, their words came in garbled tones, their jaws twisted so harshly that their speech was difficult to follow. When asked directly if there was a child inside, Philip would only shake his head, his lips curling into something that could have been either anger or sorrow. George, on the other hand, would lower his gaze, pressing his hand against the wall of the shack as though steadying himself against some unspoken weight. For the families living along the Atchafalaya, silence was not reassurance. The absence of denial only made the whispers grow stronger. Mothers began to keep their children closer, warning them not to play near the edges of the swamp. Men talked in hushed tones at the general store about whether the sheriff should intervene, though few dared to act. To accuse the brothers outright would mean confronting the shame of a family already rejected, a task few wanted to take on. And yet, those who had seen the brothers in moments of stillness noticed subtle gestures that stirred unease. George was once spotted at dusk, rocking gently on the porch bench, his arms moving as though cradling something invisible. Another time, Philip was seen carrying a bundle wrapped tightly in cloth, holding it with a protectiveness that belied its ordinary appearance. To outsiders, these moments became fuel for imagination, each citing a confirmation of the story taking shape in their minds. Behind closed doors, neighbors whispered about what kind of child might be hidden there. Was it another soul marked by deformity, born into a lineage already scarred by generations of secrecy? Or was it a child taken from elsewhere, hidden away to protect the family from more accusations? No one knew, but the mystery was enough to keep the community on edge. The shack stood like a swollen wound in the heart of the swamp, rotting wood clinging to its frame, its windows forever sealed against the world. And inside, the brothers remained, a pair of crooked silhouettes guarding a secret that grew heavier by the year. If you want to follow more hidden cases that reveal dark truths, don't forget to subscribe, because the Crooked Brothers' secret was only beginning to unravel, and the whispers of the bayou were growing louder with every passing night. The truth of that weight began to surface not through rumor, but through paper. In the spring of 1951, the Parish Records Office uncovered something unexpected while auditing old documents. Tucked between yellowed land deeds and baptismal listings, a birth record surfaced dated 1947. The surname was Boudreau, the address listed as the shack on the edge of the Atchafalaya, but where the line for the parents' names should have been, the page was marred with smudges, as though someone had tried to erase what was once written. Only the faint outline of the letters remained, blurred but undeniable. The clerk who found it was unsettled. He carried the document to the parish priest, who read it in silence, his lips pressed tight. He did not speak of it publicly, but word travels fast in places where isolation and suspicion mingle. Soon the whispers carried a new edge. The Crooked Brothers had not simply inherited deformity, they had fathered a child in secret. Philip and George were seen even less often after the discovery. Their fishing trips became rare, their foraging along the swamp nearly non-existent. When spotted, they appeared more haggard, more guarded, their eyes darting from shadow to shadow as though expecting pursuit. The shack itself seemed to shrink, its boards sagging, the roofline collapsing inward as if the weight of its secret was crushing it from above. One woman, who claimed to have glimpsed a child's figure through a crack in the boards, described what she saw in chilling detail. She spoke of a small body, legs bent unnaturally, arms thin as reeds. The image haunted her, and she swore she could not sleep without hearing the sound of shallow, gasping breaths. Her testimony spread through the parish like fire, igniting both pity and revulsion. The community began to fracture. Some argued that the child, if it existed, deserved to be removed from the swamp, given a life free from secrecy and shame. Others whispered that the bloodline was too marked, too tainted by deformity and silence, to ever belong among them. The Crooked Brothers had become not just a family but a symbol, a warning of what happens when shame festers in isolation. A local historian later reflected on the parish records and the whispers surrounding them. He said the birth record was not merely evidence of life, but of concealment, the kind of concealment that corrodes from within. To him, the document revealed not only the presence of a hidden child, but the lengths a family would go to keep their truth buried beneath mud and rot. The swamp itself seemed complicit, its waters rising each spring to lick at the edges of the shack, as though trying to erase what lay within. But erasure was impossible. The weight of secrecy was too heavy, pressing down on the brothers, warping their already twisted frames with a burden no one could carry forever. In the spring of 1952, the parish sheriff finally took notice. Pressured by whispers that grew harder to ignore, he traveled by boat into the bayou, determined to confront the brothers and settle the matter. His deputies stayed behind, unwilling to wade into waters where superstition and suspicion mingled too thickly. Alone, he arrived at the shack, his lantern cutting across the gray mist that clung to the swamp like a shroud. He knocked on the sagging door, but there was no answer. Inside, he claimed later, he heard only silence, the kind of silence that rings in the ears, weighted and unnatural. Yet as he lingered, his lantern flickered against the warped wood, and he swore he saw a movement through the slats, a small shadow ducking low, retreating into the darkness of the shack. His hand went to his revolver, though he never drew it. When he returned to town, he told the people there was nothing to worry about. He insisted the brothers were strange, yes, but harmless. He told them no child was inside, no voices, no cries, only two reclusive men clinging to the last remnants of their mother's shame. His words carried authority, and for a time they cooled the fire of suspicion. But the cooling was short-lived. A fisherman who lived near the waterline claimed otherwise. One dusk, he said, he heard the faint singing of a lullaby, not in the garbled tones of the brothers, but in a higher, trembling voice, like that of a child struggling to form words. Another neighbor described a small figure darting into the tree line at dawn, barefoot and hunched, disappearing as quickly as it appeared. The sheriff dismissed these reports as imagination, stirred by swamp mist and isolation. Yet doubts spread again. The parish split between those who trusted his word and those who believed he had looked away to spare the town from facing something too shameful to acknowledge. The brothers themselves remained elusive. They kept to their shack, appearing only when necessity forced them. George's shoulders sagged lower each year, as if the weight he carried was pulling him into the ground. Philip grew more aggressive when approached, his crooked jaw set firm, his eyes flashing with something like defiance. For a time, it seemed possible that the sheriff had been right, that the shadows were nothing more than tricks of light, that the cries were only night birds echoing through cypress trunks. But the rumors never died, and each new sighting revived the dread. The truth was not in the sheriff's report, nor in the whispers of neighbors. It lay inside the shack itself, where the damp air carried a secret too fragile to withstand the light of day, and where the cries, if they truly belonged to a child, were muffled not by silence, but by shame. By the mid-1950s, shame had seeped so deep into the walls of the shack that even its wood seemed to sag beneath it. The community's whispers had grown weary, but never gone. Then came the day when one of the parish's doctors, a man named Dr. Emile Fontenot, broke the uneasy quiet. He spoke carefully, but his words were like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that could not be contained. He had been called, years earlier, to tend to Marie Boudreau in the final months of her life. What he revealed, in confidence to a small circle of church elders, was that during his visits he had seen more than Marie's fading body. He remembered the sight of a child, thin and pale, no more than 2 years old, lingering in the background of the shack. The memory had haunted him. Thin arms folded tightly across a narrow chest, eyes too large for the small, bent face. He said the child never spoke, only stared, as though frightened by the presence of anyone beyond the shack's walls. Dr. Fontenot confessed he had chosen silence then, unwilling to invite scandal upon a family already consumed by it. Yet as the years passed, the guilt grew heavier. He had sworn an oath to protect life, and the image of that frail figure in the shadows of the shack gnawed at him until he could no longer carry it alone. His words reignited the parish. Some saw his testimony as confirmation, others as the weary ramblings of a doctor burdened by memory. But for many, his account pierced the veil of rumor. If a physician, a man of learning, a man who dealt in evidence and healing, had seen the child, then the whispers were no longer just whispers. For the Crooked brothers, this revelation marked a new descent into isolation. They stopped coming into town altogether. The shack became their fortress, its windows boarded tighter, its door barred from within. Nights in the bayou grew tense, neighbors reporting faint glows of lamplight, seeping through cracks long thought sealed, the sounds of movement echoing faintly over the water. And still, the figure of the hidden child lingered in people's minds. Was it alive still, growing within those walls? Was it marked as the brothers were, another life bent by secrecy and shame? Or had it passed quietly, leaving only memory behind? Dr. Fontenot's confession split the parish between compassion and revulsion. Some prayed for the child's survival, others demanded action, insisting the swamp could no longer hide what it sheltered. And yet, no one dared step inside. The shack stood untouchable, a shrine to secrecy that seemed to dare anyone to uncover its truth. Leave a comment if you believe truth must always be revealed, no matter how hidden, because in the bayou, silence and secrecy had long ruled. But cracks were beginning to show. The cracks widened in 1954 when a school teacher from a nearby parish traveling the bayou by boat claimed she saw something that unsettled her for the rest of her life. She described rowing past the shack at dawn when mist hung low and the water was glassy. In the dim light, she saw a child, thin, crooked, barefoot, standing on the porch with George. The boy's head hung at an odd angle, and his shoulders curved sharply inward. But what struck her most was the stillness. He did not wave, did not move, only stared at her boat as though watching something that would never return. The teacher spoke cautiously, fearing ridicule, but her voice carried authority in a community where education was rare. She had no reason to lie, and her words struck deeper than the gossip of fishermen or neighbors. Soon, her account joined Dr. Fontenot's confession, building a picture too vivid to dismiss. The Crooked brothers' silence grew more menacing with each revelation. Philip was spotted once by a trapper, crouched in the reeds with a rifle resting across his knees. His twisted mouth curled into what might have been a smile, though it was jagged and joyless. He said nothing, but the message was clear. No one was to come closer. George, in contrast, was seen at the water's edge days later, holding something small in his arms, rocking gently, his lips moving in words too soft to hear. Inside the parish, arguments raged. Some believed the child, if still alive, was the result of a hidden family bond too shameful to name. Others said it did not matter where the child had come from. What mattered was its suffering in a place unfit for survival. The question became not whether the child existed, but whether anyone had the courage to act. A psychiatrist from Baton Rouge, brought in by church elders seeking guidance, later gave his assessment. He explained that secrecy and isolation do not merely deform bodies but twist minds, shaping behavior into patterns of fear, control, and obsession. He warned that if a child were indeed inside the shack, its development would be marked forever, not only by whatever physical burdens it carried, but by the crushing weight of silence and shame imposed upon it. His words lingered heavy and clinical, adding a layer of inevitability to the fear. It was no longer just a story of two deformed brothers hidden in the bayou. It was the story of what happens when secrecy takes root, generation after generation, until it grows into something too frail to survive in the light. And still, the shack stood, Its boards groaned in the humid air, its windows remained shuttered, and the figures within moved like shadows against the lamplight, never stepping fully into view. Whatever truth lived inside, it stayed cloaked, its silence louder than any words the brothers might have spoken. In 1955, that silence was momentarily broken, not by the brothers but by an unexpected discovery in the archives of the parish courthouse. A researcher sorting through neglected files for a genealogical project stumbled upon a faded ledger. Buried among ordinary entries of baptisms and marriages was a line so peculiar it unsettled him deeply, a child listed only as unknown Boudreaux. No parents were named, no godparents recorded, and the notation ended with a single phrase scrawled in the margins: kept outside grace. The record was dated 1948, only a year after the supposed cries were first reported. It bore the signature of a deacon long since deceased, a man known for his meticulous hand. The researcher, troubled, presented the page to the parish council. Within weeks, its contents had spread across the bayou, reviving old fears with new conviction. For the people of the Atchafalaya, this was proof, not rumor. A child had indeed existed, marked from the start as separate, denied even the recognition of family or faith. The phrase "kept outside grace" suggested not simply secrecy, but intentional exile, as if the child had been judged unworthy of inclusion in the community's records. The Crooked brothers, of course, never addressed the discovery. When word reached them, and it surely must have, the shack grew more impenetrable. Philip was glimpsed only once that year, paddling a pirogue loaded with firewood, his twisted features rigid, his eyes avoiding all who saw him. George disappeared almost entirely from sight. Yet neighbors claimed the shack was not empty. Some swore they heard faint thumps in the night, like footsteps too light to belong to grown men. Others spoke of shadows moving against lamplight, thinner and shorter than the brothers. Each account was disputed, but none could be disproven. A social worker brought in from New Orleans to evaluate the situation found herself turned back. She described the swamp as alive with warning, the locals unwilling to guide her near. When she pressed for answers, she was met with silence, as though the community itself had adopted the brothers' code of secrecy. The story of the Crooked brothers was shifting once more. No longer just an account of deformity, shame, or whispered sightings. It was now tied to official record, to the cold ink of a ledger that could not be denied. The phrase "kept outside grace" became a refrain among the townsfolk, murmured with fear, sometimes with pity, always with unease. Whatever truth lived inside that shack, it was becoming harder to keep it buried beneath wood and swamp water. Records do not rot like boards, and ink does not decay like human flesh. The past, once written, has a way of clawing back into the present. By 1956, the past had clawed so deeply into the lives of the Crooked brothers that it could no longer be ignored. The parish council, emboldened by the discovery of the ledger, petitioned for intervention. For the first time, an official inquiry was set in motion, fragile as it was, into the lives hidden inside the shack. The inquiry never reached the courtroom. The bayou itself resisted. Roads washed out, guides refused, deputies claimed sickness rather than step-foot on the swamp paths leading to the brothers' dwelling. Yet fragments of testimony trickled in. A hunter admitted under oath that he had heard a child's laughter, thin and fleeting, while passing the shack at dusk. Another, more hesitant, described seeing a face pressed against the window, a pale, crooked reflection that vanished as soon as it was noticed. The weight of secrecy was collapsing under its own contradictions. Still, when the parish judge reviewed the evidence, he delivered no order to remove the child, no warrant to search the shack. His words were damning in their ambiguity. Some truths are too tangled to be undone without breaking what remains whole. To the townsfolk, it felt like surrender, a decision to let the swamp keep its secrets rather than drag them into the light. This leniency stirred anger. Parents in the parish wondered why law could intervene for others but not for the Boudreau family. A mother who had lost her own child to fever years earlier wept openly, asking how the law could leave another to suffer in silence. Yet others defended the judge, claiming that to interfere would be to curse the entire community, to force open a wound that might never heal. The Crooked brothers, aware of the rising tensions, seemed to retreat further into the shadows of their shack. Neighbors reported no sightings for weeks at a time. The only signs of life were the occasional glow of a lantern through the cracks, or the faint sound of something dragging across wooden floorboards. The swamp, as though complicit, swallowed their presence, leaving only silence to echo across the water. In this silence, the community divided sharply. Compassion wrestled with revulsion, and morality tangled with superstition. Some demanded justice, others begged for quiet, and all the while the shack stood as a grotesque monument to what the parish had allowed to fester. A historian later reflected that the greatest crime was not what happened inside the shack, but what happened outside of it, a community choosing to look away. The past had clawed back into the present, and when given the chance to face it, the people turned their heads. By 1957, turning away had become a kind of ritual. The shack remained, hunched like a crippled figure in the swamp, and the parish moved around it as though it were a wound that must never be touched. Yet the silence began to fray when illness struck one of the brothers. George was seen stumbling along the water's edge, coughing violently, his twisted frame shuddering with every breath. His eyes appeared sunken, his skin pale as swamp lilies left too long in the sun. A local boatman found him collapsed on a bank, but when help was offered, Philip emerged from the reeds, rifle in hand, his body taut with fury. No words were spoken, but the threat was clear. The shack would remain closed, even if sickness dragged its inhabitants to the grave. The story might have ended in silence again, but the illness forced something into the open. A neighbor swore that on a moonless night, he heard not only George's coughing, but also another voice, thin, trembling, higher than a man's. It was the sound of someone calling out, not in words, but in strained moans, a cry that broke through the night like a confession. For the first time in years, the whispers grew into certainty. Whatever lived inside that shack was not only real, it was suffering. The parish called once more for intervention. A social worker was dispatched, though she never reached the door. Later, in a recorded statement, she admitted she could not bear the sound that carried across the swamp that night. She described it as the cry of a child too old to sound like a child, the voice of someone trapped between youth and age, caught in a body that had never grown straight. Her words shook those who heard them, not because they proved the whispers true, but because they hinted at the cost of keeping silence for too long. Yet again, no one entered. The sheriff, worn and aging, refused to order an incursion. "There are some doors," he said bitterly, "that should never be opened by human hands." His decision was remembered less as wisdom than as cowardice, a choice that left the burden of truth buried in the mud. The Crooked brothers lived on in shadow, but their legend spread beyond the bayou. Journalists came only to be turned away. Stories circulated in Baton Rouge and New Orleans, where the shack was spoken of as a place cursed, where shame had taken form in flesh. The community was left fractured, some demanding truth, others clinging to silence, all of them haunted by the sounds that seeped from behind the rotting boards. By 1958, those sounds had faded into silence. The shack, once alive with faint cries, coughing, and muffled footsteps, grew still. Hunters passing by noted the absence of lantern light, the lack of movement around the water's edge. It was as if the swamp itself had swallowed its inhabitants whole. When months passed without a single sighting, curiosity overcame fear. A group of men, tired of whispers, ventured out by boat. They found the shack leaning harder than ever, its roof caved, its boards collapsing inward. The door hung from one hinge, the wood swollen and black with rot. Inside, the air was heavy with the stench of abandonment, the smell of dampness and something older lingering in the bones of the place. They found no bodies. Only remnants remained. 2 cots pushed against opposite walls, rusted cooking pots, and the faint outline of footprints pressed into the dirt floor. One corner of the shack revealed something stranger, a crude wooden cradle broken at the joints, its blankets long mildewed. The cradle was too small for a grown child, too large for an infant, as if it had been built for something that never fit the world outside those walls. Behind the shack, in the soft soil near the crooked wooden cross where their mother had been buried, fresh earth had been disturbed. No markers stood, only uneven mounds that suggested more than one body had been laid to rest there. Whether the brothers had been buried together or whether one had buried the others before succumbing to the swamp himself, no one could say. The graves told no stories and the bayou gave no answers. In the end, the community chose silence once more. The shack was left to collapse into the mud, its boards sinking year by year into the dark water. The site became a place of avoidance, a cursed corner of the swamp where few dared linger. The Crooked brothers faded into folklore, their story carried in whispers rather than records, their truth forever blurred between rumor and reality. Yet, even in silence, the weight of their legacy endured. The shack stood as a reminder of what secrecy can build when left unchecked. Walls that imprison, shadows that linger, cries that echo long after voices have gone still. Children growing up in the parish were warned never to wander too close to the basin. The shack is listening, their elders would say, and if you hear the cries, it's already too late. Years later, when the last boards finally collapsed into the water, all that remained was the crooked cross, tilted against the rising mist, watching over a patch of ground where shame and secrecy had been laid to rest.